I'm going to tell you all about hand positions, left and right, the Ida Presti position, and a little bit about the sort of background information, just sort of the scientific or physiological reasons for why different things work or don't work. So the first thing we'll start with is what you're actually trying to do with the guitar. And one of the misconceptions that's prominent is what direction the strings pluck. Now, you may already know some of this stuff, so forgive me if I go over things that you already know. But a lot of people think that the strings vibrate this way, and they think that they're plucking them sideways. This actually can pretty easily prove that this isn't what's going on, because if you try plucking the strings sideways like this, you don't get much noise out. Whereas if you pluck them up and down, you get a lot more noise. However, as of course you know, there is a little problem, because if you pluck out real hard, then you get a rather nasty sound, which is not, what you want. However, if you pluck up here, like that, it sounds pretty good. Mystery, how come it sounds snappy here and pretty good here when you pluck the same distance from the edges? The reason is that the high point in the string, you're pulling it up here. Then the next thing that the string does is it goes down here where there are frets, whap, and makes a nasty noise. Then it goes up here where there aren't frets in there. In other words, the high point of the string describes a sort of an S shape. And so naturally, if you pluck up here, then you have the absolute worst case scenario, because it comes down here and makes a nasty noise. If you pluck up here, then the first thing it does after going up here is to come down here where there aren't any frets, then up here where there aren't any frets, and only 3/4 of a cycle later does it hit the frets here, which is long enough that the string is tired enough that actually the string gets tired pretty quickly. So the attack of a guitar is very, very high amplitude and then goes down to something quite low. So we can do a sort of a trick, because it's not practical to play the guitar by plucking up this way, even though it sounds good. But let's imagine we can pluck down. Now that works pretty well too. If I just push the string down, then it sounds good, because you're pushing it down, and then it goes up here where there are no frets, then down here where there are, but that's a half a cycle later, no problem. So actually, in truth, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to pluck the string down, and then that makes the strings vibrate up and down as much as possible. I mean, obviously you're going to go sideways a little bit, but you want it down as much as you can, because if you think about it, that's obviously what's going to work with the bridge, because the bridge is the bridge between the strings and the top of the guitar. So what happens when you pluck the string so that it vibrates up and down is that the bridge also can go up and down. It also can tilt a little bit this way. It also can tilt a little bit this way, but it certainly can't go sideways. It's glued on. So that's how you get the noise out of the guitar. So what we're trying to do, by whatever way we can, is to push the string down as far as we can and get out of the way so that it can then come up and vibrate up and down. Now, the question, how do you do that? Well, here's how you do it. Let's imagine that this right here is one fingernail, with the short edge of the fingernail and the longer middle of the fingernail, so we have a kind of a ramp there. Okay, now here's the string, cross-section of string. Now here comes the fingernail coming along, and when the short edge of the fingernail hits the string, as long as you don't pull up, if you keep pushing down and keep playing what you think is sideways, then it will force the string down as the nail goes over it. And then when you run out of nail toward the middle of the nail, then the string will start to vibrate up and down more or less. So you're pushing the string down as you go by and trying to stay as low to the ground as you possibly can, so that you don't snatch the string up at all and don't make it vibrate sideways. You see, if you pull your nail up very much, then the string will just go sideways and it won't make that nice big sound that you want. Now, that takes care of the guitar end of the deal. Then you need to worry about what your hands actually are doing. Now, this is sort of an interesting phenomenon about people. We have two ways of holding things. If we really seriously want to hang on to something really tightly, like, you know, our ancestors with their battle axes, or with, you know, swinging from tree branches or whatever, you do what's called the power grip. Now, in that, the thumb is wrapped around the thing one way, the fingers are wrapped around another way, and you've really got it there. And that's the strongest thing you can do with your hand. Even little babies can do that pretty well. If you stick a finger, they grab it, and they grab it just this way. That's very strong motion, just to do this. You might want to do a close-up of that motion, so that you're grabbing it with your fingers coming around. Your fingers basically come in towards your thumb. They don't go down that way. They come around, and your thumb is coming around this way. Just like wringing out a dish rag or something, or squeezing something. That's how hands work. So if you can get that mechanism working for the guitar, then you're in good shape. You can make a lot of noise without too much effort. And that's exactly what the Presti position is so good at doing. It stabilizes your hand and allows you to use this power grip kind of motion to play. Okay, now, hold general position. Obviously, you have a footstool of some sort to get your knee up a little bit higher than your hips. You put the guitar flat on it. Have your foot flat on the footstool so that you don't get real tired and have it wobbling after a while. You have somewhere around the middle hitting your right knee, and the guitar tilted fairly substantially. Then you put your arm on top of the guitar and just let it hang down loosely. And you lean against the guitar so it's nice and stable and solid. Okay, now, if you do that and you just let your hand hang down with your fingers curved, more or less just the way they'd be curved if you just were walking along the street and not thinking about them at all. See, we've got a shadow on the guitar. I don't know if that's, well, I'll try to keep it upright a little bit more. Yeah, there, that, okay, that's better. If you just have your hand hanging down very loosely, and you just work as much as possible with these, the first knuckle, the knuckle that's nearest to your hand, to the palm of your hand. So you just, anybody can do this kind of thing very, very easily. Wiggling your fingers loosely. This is easy to do, very independent, no big problems. So that's what you want to use as much as possible, is that motion from here. Now, if you take this knuckle and move it, that's harder to do. That's considerably harder to do independently. Keep your fingers all straight and move like this. You know, that takes a little thinking. And I can't do the tip joints, and very few people can move them separately. So you can use this a little bit, but you don't want to really get any power from there. The power all comes from back here. The whole hand, the whole finger moving as a unit. So you keep your finger kind of cocked in a nice curvy kind of position. Just a nice reasonable curve, and then you move the whole thing as a unit. Now, since your hand is hanging down with your fingers that are basically going to pluck up this direction, even if you just use them the plain old way, since they're pointed a little bit toward your thumb, they're going to pluck more or less this way. But your fingernails, of course, are aligned more or less along this axis. So you have the nails going this way, the pluck direction going that way, and what you end up with is that the piece of nail that's on the string is basically coming really pretty much straight back. You have one of these kind of deals where, you know, the point on the string is in the middle there, and you have two different angles that end up making a straight line. And you can tell that by, if you play on the 6th string, for instance, you don't get any scrapes. You just get a nice clean sound because you're coming straight back along probably one groove. Okay, so that in essence is what you're doing. Now, as you attack the string, if you had your fingers stretched out too far, then you might snag along the left-hand part of the nail. But what you do is you curve your fingers a little bit until you end up with the right-hand corner of the nail just snuggled up right against the string. and we may need a couple of close-ups of this. So the right-hand corner of the nail is touching the string right at the beginning of the stroke, and then the string passes over the nail until it gets to the middle, and then that's the end of it, and you're working from here using the finger as a unit. And you're plucking against your arm. I'll explain that a little bit more. Okay, now I'm going to explain a little bit about how you know where to position your hand, because that matters quite a lot. Let's imagine now that these are 3 strings. Okay? Now, this knuckle, the one nearest your hand, let's imagine that you put it right up here somewhere. Then your finger is going to be sort of more or less that. And if you just swing this just very normally without doing much of anything with that, you're going to get something like that for a trajectory, which is exactly what you want. You hit this string, you don't hit those 2 strings, and everything's wonderful. Even if you move this down a little bit, let's say, you'll get a little bit more bent finger, which is what I was doing. Then you get a little bit more of a curve. You still miss these 2 strings, you hit that one, but you do have to move this a little bit to get the different strings. I think my proportions are a little bit off. Now, what you don't want to do is what a lot of people try to do, and what doesn't work, is if you put this knuckle over here somewhere, in other words, not more or less over the string you're trying to hit, then here's the finger, goes along like that. Now, you swing the finger just normally, and what happens? The circle is basically going to go this direction, but you don't want to do that. You can get away with it if you're doing an apoyando, but if you're doing a tirando, you can't get away with it because you're going to hit this string. So people tend to try to do that, and then what they do, because they don't want to hit the string, is they suddenly have to do a detour out of the natural trajectory of the string, and the way they do that is to bend this, maybe even to bend that going up, maybe even to bring the whole hand up to avoid hitting this string. That's what not to do. Doesn't work. Makes you big problems and causes all sorts of problems, because how you move these fingers is, of course, by pulling tendons and muscles on this side of your arm. But how you do this is by pulling tendons on the top of your arm. So if you're trying to pull this knuckle up and these in at the same time, you're pulling muscles up here and you're pulling muscles down here all at the same time. And all it ends up getting is very, very tight, tense wrist. So it's very important that your hand be positioned with this knuckle out far enough away from the guitar, far enough up that there's plenty of room for the finger to swing by, push this string down, and then get out of the way of that one without your having to do anything fancy with these knuckles and without having to move your hand. Okay, the important thing is to make sure that this knuckle is more or less over the string that you're trying to pluck, and that it's out far enough that there's plenty of room for your fingers to swing nicely. So then you'll get a nice swing. You don't have to do anything fancy to the finger other than just use it as a unit and move it back. Now, if you have your wrist too low or your back too far so that this knuckle is more over a string that's back, say 2 strings or 1 string or 2, 3 strings even from where you're playing, then what happens is if you would try to just push your finger down, it wouldn't work because the string's in the way. So you have no place to go. So then what happens is you'll tend to pull these knuckles and do what I was describing. You may even pull the whole finger up instead. And a lot of people play that way. And first off, one problem is, of course, it tends to make just the kind of snaps that we don't want anyway. And it's terrible for your hand. It's really, really, really super hard on your anatomy, because these muscles pulling this knuckle down are, as we said, very independent. They work very well. Not these guys so much. This one is fairly independent, but these are not. You can try a little experiment. If you curve your fingers a little bit, try to hold the curve, and then say pull on your third, your A finger. You'll find that the other two, your M and your little finger, will curl up, and you'll have a hard time straightening them out. You could probably straighten out one or the other, but I give you my guitar if you can straighten out both of them and keep this one curved and under tension. You probably can't do it because these fingers are all reliant on some of the same muscles to move them and some of the same neurons to tell them to move. So they're very, very attached to each other. That's why you have a little bit more difficulty playing with the M and the A. So you want to make sure that this knuckle is pretty much over the string that you're going to play, and that your fingers just move nice and loosely. There's sort of a trick question. Another question about just relaxation in general is you want to have your wrist really, really super relaxed and your hand just dangling there. Now, let's imagine that you put your wrist back too far or too low, and you're going to play using these knuckles, which is sort of what you have to do if you do that. Now, let's imagine that with doing that, I'm going to also relax my wrist completely. Think what's going to happen. Very, very few people guess this because it's kind of a surprise. If you relax your wrist completely, which is good and which you want to do, but you've got your hand in such a position that you can't push from here and you have to pull from here, then what happens is you don't get any note at all. You just pull your hand right down on top of the guitar, because the only thing that keeps that from happening is a lot of tension in your wrist. So if you find you have a lot of tension in your wrist, loosen it. And then if you can figure out how to position your hand, a lot of it is just where your wrist goes. Your arm is resting on top of the guitar, and what you're really doing is plucking, which kind of pulls your arm down on top of the guitar as you pluck a little bit. That's what takes up the pressure. Not any tension or holding your arm in place. Your arm is not held in place. It's just sitting there. Just lies there, very relaxed, hanging down very loosely, pretty well however it hangs. And then you just pluck using these fingers. Okay, now we come to the thumb. The problem with the thumb with people who've played in this kind of a position for a long time is the thumb often hasn't had to do anything. It just sort of sits there and orders the arm around. It says, arm, I want to play on the 6th string, and then the arm moves there. And then arm, I want to play on the 3rd string, and the arm moves there. And the thumb doesn't really get much exercise or learn to do much of anything itself. And that's why you get people doing chords and things, that they do the thumb first and the fingers first, because the arm is pulling the fingers and pulling the thumb. And of course it doesn't sound too good either. It's not as solid a chord as you could get. But anyway, the whole thing with the thumb is to make sure that it maintains its independence and does its own work. So you should be able to use the thumb without really moving the fingers at all. Now, one way of testing this out is play some notes, so say on the 1st string, and get your hand nice and relaxed, and then just put your fingers very loosely on that string, and then try playing with the thumb. Now with the thumb you're doing exactly the opposite thing of what the fingers are doing, but with exactly the same result. You're starting at the middle of the thumb, you're pushing the string down with the middle of the thumb, sliding from the middle to the back edge of it, and getting out of the way of the next string. So you're making kind of little ovals. You're pulling your thumb in towards your hand, and then as soon as you've got to the point where you would be hitting the next string, you get out of the way by pulling it up around that way. So you should be able to do this kind of thing with your thumb, and only your thumb is moving, your wrist is relaxed, your fingers are just hanging there, and they're right in position where they could play anything you wanted to anytime. You could try also doing things like this, of sliding over 3 or 4 bases, again, without doing anything with your hand. Another good test to test your hand position is if you would try playing an apoyando with the A finger back over, say, 3 or 4 notes, and then try try it, and I'll go on to with the thumb over 3 or 4 notes, and then try to do them both together. This is actually a very nice way of playing a quick chord. If you need a chord, a 6-note chord that is going to sound as though you played it with 6 fingers, you can do it that way by just pulling the A back, keeping it a little bit. You probably have to straighten it out a little bit more and get your wrist out from the guitar even a little bit more to reach it. Because the further your wrist is out, the more strings you can cover with a given swipe, shall we say. If you're really in close, then you probably only can hit 1 string at a time. The further away you get, the more stuff you can hit. So that's a good experiment and a good exercise to find if your hand position and wrist position are as centered as possible, because you want your hand right at the center of gravity of everything you're doing, so that your thumb is being pulled in toward the center of gravity of your hand, the fingers are moving in toward the center of gravity of your hand, and there's plenty of room under there. See, lots of space for all that to happen. You've got lots of, I'm going to turn this sideways as I can so you can really see, you've got quite a lot of room there to move. Okay? Now, one little trick with chords is that, again, with this power grip, it tends to do this kind of a motion. This is a very easy thing for hands to do. So if you had, say, a round cup or something, you could turn the lid this way very easily and not so easily the other way. This is why jars have screws that when you're trying to tighten it, it goes this way. Screwdrivers also, they're all built for right-handed people, so that's why they turn that way, because this is the way hands work. This is also the way chords work. So with a chord, you can't obviously have your hand exactly over each string, because you've got 3 different strings with the fingers and 1 with the thumb, and they won't all be perfect. So what you do when you're playing a chord is, and you can see Presti doing this on any tapes of her, is you put your fingers down, and maybe 1 of them or 2 of them will be just perfect, and the nail would be right up against the string right in the beginning of the stroke, which is what you need. You don't want the nail to hit later. It's got to be right there in the beginning. So maybe 1 or 2 are right, maybe only 1 is right, whatever. But what you do is then you tilt your fingers very, very slightly. You pivot them sort of in their sockets, a little bit like so. Just pivot them around so that you snuggle the string up against the nail, or snuggle the nail up against the string. So you're doing a little bit of a, again, a little bit of a circular motion. You're not kind of coming up that way, but you're coming up with a little bit of a screwing on a jar of peanut butter or a jar of jam or something, or wringing out a dish rag kind of a motion. And you'll see Presti doing that. And that's important to do that pulling around, because that'll make you a nicer sound. So in general, relax your hand really, really loosely. Let your fingers flop. Let them just move from here. Try to make sure that the nail is right there in the beginning, and of course as smooth as possible. And push back toward the... When you get it right, you'll feel as though you're playing very, very loudly, you're making a big sound, and you aren't making very much effort. If you feel you have to make an effort, a strong effort, or that you're tense at all to do this, then you're not doing it right. It's the same kind of thing as if you're hammering a nail into a wall, let's say. You're holding the hammer. If you're doing it right, you go whap, and you know you're almost throwing the hammer at the nail. Let's say you're confident enough, you're not worried if you're going to miss the nail. You just take the hammer and go bam. No, when it really works and the nail really goes in well, what you'll find is that you're really not holding on to the hammer all that hard when you're contacting the nail. You already kind of loosened up. You're basically getting the thing going and then just letting it go. So you're not tense all the way through. So you're not directing your fingers at all. You just let them, get them lined up, give them a shove, and then there they go. Now, a little bit about the left hand. Let's imagine that this is the fingerboard. Put your fingers, well, one thing about position actually I should deal with first. if you just let your arm relax, hang down, then you bring it up with your elbows still just hanging down next to your body. Then see where you can reach without doing anything with your elbow. That's where the fingerboard ought to be. So that will determine where you put the footstool, how high your knee is, where you can move, all sorts of things. But you want that to be so that it's really comfortable and you don't have to do anything fancy to get your hand in position, or reach down or do any sort of weird stuff. You just want it to be there. Okay, now let's imagine you're going to put your fingers on, let's say, with a nice reasonable stretch, as though this were a fingerboard. Then put your thumb and see if you feel well supported. Your thumb will probably be about underneath your second finger, maybe even under between your second and third. It's not going to be over here somewhere, which is where a lot of people have it, sort of underneath. They hold the fingerboard as though they were holding the first and second finger, the first finger and the thumb. And then these fingers are not supported at all. They feel as though they're just kind of banging around. Again, to take the analogy of the hammer and the nail, if you have a nail that's out on a board that's waving around in the breeze that isn't on anything, and you try to hammer the nail down, nothing happens because the wood just bounces around and you aren't able to push at all hard. This happens with a lot of guitarists. They feel very unstable with their 3 and their 4. They don't feel they can really work there because they aren't supporting it with their thumbs, so they aren't really holding on very well. Now, that will tell you where your thumb needs to go. It needs to go in back of the center of gravity of your hand, which is going to be probably in this general area around in there somewhere. Another thing to think about, and this is particularly important if you've not been taught it, because there are people around who say, well, you pull your fingers down as though you're leaning on something. If you do that, you're going to have big problems and it won't work. Because what happens, if you pull these fingers down, then what you're really doing is you're using your shoulder and your back muscles to pull. Okay, now, you say, well, okay, they're big, they're strong. Yeah, but how do you really move them around? You can't. Another problem is that if, for instance, you pull hard on your tube, then these guys are going to go down, because really all you're doing is you're making a hook out of your fingers, and then you're just exerting some tension. And again, any of these 3 fingers that you make a hook on, the others will all bend too, so they'll all go down. You don't want to do that. First off, it's totally impractical to use muscles in your back and back here somewhere to try to move your fingers around. It doesn't work very well. But you certainly don't want your resting position of your fingers to be down underneath the fingerboard. Then you've got to get them out each time. That actually is like, imagine that you're hanging from some sort of a bar, an overhead bar. Okay, so you're all balanced and everything's fine. Now let's imagine you let go one hand. Then that's going to skew your balance. Then to try to get this hand back up to the bar is not easy to do at all. And that's what a lot of people end up doing here. They're hanging on with their one finger. These guys are down here someplace. So they're hanging underneath the fingerboard. And, they're really absolutely not. Let's see if I can get it in position. You see, you'd be like that. This is not the thing to do. Your fingers need to have, as a resting position, that they're hovering maybe that much above the string. And they're pressing against the thumb, which is pushing the other direction, so that your fingers have something to push against. And then when the fingers come down, they come down. Again, they're moving same sort of way as the right hand. They're moving as a unit and trying to keep curved, so they come down on their tips. And if they're not playing, then they just relax and they go back into their natural curved position, which is what your hand will do if you just sort of hold it someplace. And if they're being used, then you push down. The reason that many people tend to try to find power by pulling from their shoulders and their elbows and all sorts of other things gets back into this deal of the power grip. Because, for instance, your standard rock position is something like that. Does that look familiar? Same thing, right? Power grip. But unfortunately, the power grip, though it's very nice and strong, which is why rock guitarists use it, it doesn't enable you to move your fingers very much, and of course it means that your little finger, for instance, can hardly even reach to the fingerboard sometimes. It certainly can't reach anything very complicated, and your fingers aren't enabled to really move around. So there's another way that human beings can hold stuff. There's the power grip, and then there's the precision grip. And the precision grip is the thing that you have to use for the left hand. And it's not as strong. It absolutely is not as strong as the power grip, for sure. And that's why people who are first starting the guitar tend to try to hang on with the power grip. They tend to try to use that every chance they get. And you have to resist that. And if you teach any people, you've got to make sure that they try to use the precision grip and keep their fingers just hovering over, so you can see, just hovering over the strings, so that they just are sitting there waiting, and probably at the same distance as the frets are apart, preferably, which is a hard thing to do too, actually. Keeping your fingers apart as much as possible is a little bit tricky, but you want to try to do it. Doing this sort of chromatic exercise, very good for the left hand. Now, you may already have a wonderful left hand, and you may already know all this stuff, but anyway, that's just an added thing to say. Now, one other factor with the left hand that's kind of interesting, that sometimes you get people who, if they're trying to stretch, the little finger will stick out, or the first finger will stick out. The reason for that's kind of interesting, that in fact you basically have two ways of pulling your fingers up this way. If you just ask somebody to stretch their fingers apart as far as they can, they'll inevitably go like this. They'll stretch their fingers apart, but they'll also pull them back as hard as they can, which you didn't ask them to do. You just said to stretch. But they don't do that. They pull them back and stretch. This is because there are two sets of muscles that do this. There are the little muscles in between your fingers called the interosseous muscles. They're mostly on the back side of your hand, and they're the guys that make your fingers spread apart and keep them apart. And then those also, since they're on the back of your hand, they also help to pull your fingers back. And then, of course, you have the muscles back here that also pull your fingers back. Now, you could do something like this with keeping your fingers curved and stretching them apart. But mostly people don't think to do that. They just think that because they don't know they've got two sets of muscles. So they just use everything they've got. So in this stretch business, when they're trying to stretch, say, the little finger out or these two fingers apart, what happens is they tell their hands, stretch as hard as you can, and that basically means do this. Since they're using these two fingers, those don't do it, but these two do. So that's something to watch out for if you have that problem, or if you see it in other people or in students. It's something to be aware of. Now, one other factor. Some people hold the guitar much more kind of flat this way, and they hold it in, like so. This, I feel, is a big mistake, and it certainly doesn't work with the Presti position, and it gets your left hand in an extremely awkward position. But some people say, oh, well, I'm worried if I hold the guitar this far out, it'll fall on the floor. Now, this is something that is a real danger, but it's not a danger if you're doing things right. The thing that causes the guitar to feel as though it's going to fall on the floor is generally if you're doing this thing of pulling your fingers back and you're not pushing enough with your thumb, so you're not giving enough pressure. In other words, if you're pulling the guitar back this way and you're not pushing with your thumb to equalize that, what happens is you pull with your fingers, and what happens? The guitar starts to escape and fall down on the floor. So then you hang on for dear life with your arm, with your wrist too low, and this contributes to the playing with this kind of position, with your wrist way down and your fingers plucking in all the wrong ways. So the thing to think about is make sure that your thumb is doing its job. One other little factor about thumbs, actually, while we're talking about left hand, is if you have your fingers all on this way, you stick the thumb on, you'll notice that your thumb is sort of sideways. It isn't flat. Its thumbprint is not flat on on the thing. It's sideways. It's a little bit, almost completely sideways, maybe 3/4. That's the way human beings are built. That's the way your thumb is. It basically is opposite your fingers in a sideways position. It doesn't turn this way. So don't try to have your thumbprint flat on the fingerboard. Just have it sideways the way it was built. God meant it that way and we're stuck with it. So anyway, that's another thing to consider. And you want to just use it to counteract the pressure of your fingers coming down. So I think that's pretty well done. And doing that should give you a good Ida Presti position. If you have any questions, send me an email and let me know. And I'll